Hello, Louise here from the fabric shop in Ruston. I'm in my classroom and I welcome you into my classroom, and today I want to teach you about something that I'm having so much fun doing. I want to teach you about binding your quilt or placemat or table runner with a fun way of doing it by machine instead of having to do the old-fashioned way of doing it by hand. We have for years been doing binding by cutting a 2.5 inch strip, folding it in half, pressing it, sewing it on the right side, turning it around to the back side, and taking a needle and thread and blind stitching it down. And I've heard more people say, I love to piece a quilt, but I hate to put on the binding. With what I'm going to show you today, I think you will love putting on your binding because it's all done by machine, and you will love doing it. Look at the quilt behind me. This beautiful quilt behind me has flange binding on it. What it is, it's the binding that has a little extra flange on it. Let me show you another one. This quilt, one of my favorite quilts, look at the borders and the binding on this quilt. You see the flange binding on it? It just makes the quilt. It makes it so much prettier. Now, there are other kinds of binding also. If you are lucky enough to own a baby lock serger, either an Accolade, an Evolution, a Triumph, then those sergers have a wave stitch, a beautiful wave stitch that you can take your quilt that you have pieced and quilted, and you can stitch around the edge with that wave stitch, and you don't even have to have a binding. This is the edge of your quilt, and it's beautiful. If you want to get a little bit fancier, you can do the binding, put the wave stitch on the edge of it, and then stitch it down like this. Can you see up close? Here we go. You see it's got a binding edge and it has a wave stitch. Those are just some other ways of putting on binding, fun things to do. I like having fun with my binding. But let's talk about this binding, the flange binding. To do the flange binding, instead of cutting the 2.5 inch strip and folding it in half, you're going to use 2 pieces of fabric. You're going to decide which of the fabric is going to be the outside edge, and then which is going to be the little flange. It's just that little flasher right here, that little flasher that's going to make it look so pretty. The flasher part has to be the larger piece. Now, if you're from the old school and you know your math and you know your fractions, we're going to cut the piece that's going to be the binding 1 3/8 inch wide. And we're going to cut the large piece that is going to have the flange 1 3/4 inches wide. You know that 3/4 is the same thing as 6/8. You've got 3/8 here, 6/8 here, so this one's going to be 3/8 of an inch bigger than this one. Now, oh, you say, Louise, that's too much math. I don't understand eighths. Hey, my friends Kay and Kathy from the Franklin Quilt Company created you a tool, the shortcut binding tool, and they have taken all the work out of it. They have lines on here that show you 1 3/4 inch, 1 3/8 inch, and it has other things that you can do with it too. But with this ruler, you don't even have to know your math, you don't have to think. The only thing you have to remember is to decide which fabric is going to be the flange. Now, I have a whole lot of binding here that I created and then realized, oh my gosh, I wanted the blue to be the flange. I wanted this to be the binding that went over. So don't make the mistake I made. Make a decision first. What's going to be the flasher, the little flange? After you've cut it, you know what you're going to do. You're going to take those strips and you're going to sew them together, you know, with that pretty angle. You're going to put them at a right angle and sew across. And you're going to make as long a strip as you need to go around your quilt, plus about 12 inches. Then you're going to do the same thing with the other piece. Sew them together first, the long piece. Then when you start to sew these 2 pieces together, because what you're going to do is you're going to sew both pieces together with a 1/4 inch seam. But before you do, start one piece 4 to 6 inches below the other one, so that when they get to the seams that you have pieced them with, they won't be at the same place. You don't want them at the same place, so it will be that thickness there. So start one, drop one down about 4 to 6 inches, and then start sewing it together, right sides together, stitch a 1/4 inch seam, and sew all the pieces together that goes around your quilt. Now, after you have stitched it all the way around, we're going to pretend this is several yards long, enough to go around your quilt. The next thing, and this is important, set your stitches. Go to your ironing board, your wool mat that's sitting by your sewing machine, and press the seam, the stitches, just like that. Press them. After you have pressed them, then you're going to open it up, and you are going to press it with the seam toward the short side. Now, this is very, very important. The reason this is important, if you send it, let's pretend for a minute that the dark side was over here. The big side was the dark side, and this was the little side. And all your life you've been taught, press the seam to the dark side. And you press that seam to the dark side. And then you go to put them together, and you discover you've got a wad of a seam right in the, there's that seam wadded up in the little flange that's going to be your decoration on that binding. That's what I did on this one. This is the first one I ever did, and if you look at this one, you'll see I had a light fabric that was to go around the binding. The dark fabric was the flange, which was the bigger. And I just knew what I was doing, and I just pressed that over to the dark side, and I've got a mess in several places that I'm not going to point out to you. But I'm hoping you'll just see the flange and not see all of my messes. Don't we love the telephone to ring? All right, after you have pressed it to the short side, that means we've got business going on here in the store when the phone's ringing. We love to hear the phone ring. After you've pressed it to the short side, and that's important, press to the short side. You've got it looking like this. Then the next thing is to put your wrong sides together. Put your wrong sides together, press it, and it's going to look just like this, okay? One side plain, one side shows your little flange. Now I want you to use your imagination, and I want you to pretend that this is a quilt. This is a quilt. I've made my long row of binding. I'm ready to put it on my quilt. You might be binding a placemat. You might be binding a table runner. You may be adding this binding on anything that needs a pretty edge. But for today, we're going to pretend that this is a quilt. And I have written the word back, because this is the back of my quilt in my pretending. That's the front of my quilt. See, they look just alike, so I wrote back on it. To start putting your binding, now this is a little more than just the flange binding, but you know, when you start to attach binding to a piece of fabric, to a quilted piece of fabric, you want to be sure and leave 10 to 12 inches flapping before you start stitching. You don't stitch it down starting right here and keep going. That's not the right way. You start sewing and you stitch a 1/4 inch. You're going to use your wonderful 1/4 inch quilting foot. The 1/4 inch quilting foot, set your machine on straight stitch. It has a mark 1/4 inch from the needle, so you know where to stop. But you're going to start stitching, and you're going to stitch all the way to the corner, and you stop 1/4 inch before you get to the edge of the fabric. That's important. That's how you miter your corners. Very easy. Just stop and back stitch a couple of stitches. Or if you're lucky enough to have a machine that has a tie-off, just push your tie-off button. Then stop, cut your threads, take your, we'll use this part right here. I've got one corner ready to go. When you get to the corner where you've got, I hope you can see this, when you stop a 1/4 inch from the edge, then you're going to fold back, fold up at a perfect 90-degree angle. Then you're going to fold this back down, straight down. This top should be straight across the top. This should be straight down the raw edge, and you should not be able to see any of the fabric from underneath there over on the edge. If you have done it like this, you've done it correctly, and you are now ready to start stitching right here on this edge and stitch down, all the way down, raw edges together, and go to your next corner and miter it. Now we're going to pretend we've mitered 4 of our corners. We've got it all mitered and stitched. Now I'm going to use these wonderful little clips. At the end of this video, I want to show you 2 or 3 things that I think you can't do without in your sewing room. I'm going to pretend that I have finished stitching this all the way around. Now, remember I told you that when you start with 10 to 12, more business in the store, 10 to 12 inches of a flap. What you're going to do is you're going to take a ruler. This is a ruler that everybody should have in their sewing room. There are lots of rulers out there. There are wooden rulers, there are plastic rulers. But if you don't have one of these inexpensive little Dritz 6-inch hem gauge, it's called a sewing gauge. They're what? Less than $3. But it's one of the best measuring tools you'll ever have. And they've been around for 50 years. All you do is slide the slider to where you need it to be. And that way you've got a perfect measure. But if your slider is loose, then come to the fabric shop and let's get you a new one. Inexpensive, but get you a sewing gauge. All right, I have overlapped I have stopped sewing, okay? And I have overlapped my pieces. Right here, this will make or break your binding. At this point, the way you join this together is you're going to take your ruler and you're going to measure how wide is your binding. My binding happens to be 2 5/8 inches wide. So I've measured it. It's exactly 2 5/8 inches wide. Your binding may be 2 1/2 inches wide. Whether you're doing regular binding or the pretty flange binding, it's the same technique right here. Okay? So after you measure it, you're going to lay your 2 pieces down, the top piece and the bottom, the piece you started with and the piece you ended up with. Overlap them. Measure exactly 2 5 inches from the edge. Take a friction pin that the heat from the iron makes it disappear, and mark it. Mark your line right there. That tells you that's how much overlapping you're going to do. Basically, you're going to overlap the fabric, the width of the binding. If you're putting a 3-inch binding, you're going to have a 3-inch overlap. If you're putting a 2-inch binding, you're going to have a 2-inch overlap. You overlap it. You decide exactly where it overlaps, the exact amount. Then you're going to mark it. You're going to take your scissors, cut off the extra where you have marked it. It is overlapped the exact 2 5/8 inch. Now you can pick it up, and because you did not sew it all the way to the edge, you have room to pick it up and take it to your sewing machine. Mark it, overlap it. You're going to do the same diagonal stitch. Put the 2 together, pretending you're just sewing this together for the long edge around your quilt, and you're going to stitch it from corner to corner, just like you did when you pieced the pieces together. And then it will be sewed together. Then you lay it down. Take your wonderful Wonder clips, and these things are great. I'm fixing to do something. I just dropped one of them. Oh my goodness, I dropped one of my Wonder clips, and I need it. I don't like bending over. I have this wonderful tool. It's a magnetic expanding wand. It's not the light. It also has a light on it, an LED light. I can turn that on, and I reach down. I keep this in my top drawer of my sewing machine, my sewing cabinet, so that when I drop needles and pins, you want your lighted magnetic pin picker upper. And then keep that in the top drawer. One of my favorite tools. That's my second favorite tool I've showed you today. Okay, you're going to clamp it down, stitch it straight across, and you have done your flange binding. Easy. Now, okay, I've sewed it to the back. Now what? You're going to flip it over to the right side. Take your marvelous Wonder clips, clip it down. Turn your edge. You see how we're doing this? Turn your edging down. Miter this corner down. Be sure you get the little flange part Be sure you line those up so that they are even with each other, and the corners, very important that they line up together. When you get them exactly perfectly lined up, put your little wonder clip on it. Now, we've done this all the way, or at least till we ran out of wonder clips. So go to your sewing machine. So take your stitch in the ditch foot. That's exactly what it is. It is a foot designed to stitch in the ditch, and the ditch is your seam. So the stitch in the ditch foot has the 1/4 inch markings, which are wonderful, and it has a flange right down the middle of it, if you can see that. But you're going to take that foot and you're going to stitch in the ditch. You're going to stitch right in the ditch where these two fabrics meet. And I want you to notice, look up close at my corner. You see how the little flange is meeting exactly at a 90-degree angle? That 90-degree angle is very important. Just have it, the flange meeting right here. You sew right to the edge. Be sure you put your needle down button down. So your needle is down, stop, turn, and just keep going. And you're stitching it by machine, quick and easy and fun. The first time you do this, you'll say, why haven't I done this a long time ago? The second time you'll do it, you'll realize this is fun. And then you'll look forward to binding all those beautiful quilts that you're making. Got one more thing I want to show you. Another one of our wonderful tools that we have to have. I want you to see this. Forever, Clover has made this little thread cutter. There's a blade in here and little notches all the way around. Well, I have a wonderful man who makes me these blocks so that they do not fall, this does not fall over. There's a little hole in it. I put the Clover thread cutter in it, and when I'm chain piecing, did you notice all of the half square triangles on this border? You do that by chain piecing. You chain piece, and then you've got all this row of blocks ready to cut apart. Instead of taking the scissors and having to find it and cut it, or instead of taking this on a ribbon like they tell you in the instructions, you have it on a block, and it's to the left of your sewing machine. Your half square triangles or your pieces that you have chained together come out from behind your machine, and you don't have to look. You don't even have to look. You just flip and it just cuts. You can cut from the side, from the bottom. It'll just cut those pieces apart for you perfectly sharp. And this is a thread cutter with a base, available at the fabric shop in Ruston. Got another customer on the line. We love it. And I want to tell you, thank you for letting me in your home. I am having so much fun making these videos and sharing them with you. I hope you will subscribe to our YouTube channel, and I hope you'll touch the little icon on the side so that when we make new videos, and my brain has got all kind of videos that I want to share with you. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.